So thank you so much for being here. We'll get started in just a minute. Do it in 1 minute. Story of my life. Nothing is ever, particularly in the summer, I feel like nothing's ever where it's supposed to be. My camp sunglasses have ended up home, which is not good because now they're not going to look at. Good morning. Wow, I wasn't actually not expecting a response. That's amazing. You are also morning people, just like me. So good morning. I want to welcome you to our first, I'm not going to say first inaugural or first, because I don't know if when we'll do the next one, but our first Brainy Breakfast, hosted by the Center on Disability and Inclusion's Neurodiversity at SU initiative. My name's Christy Ashby. I am a professor of inclusive education and disability studies in the School of Education and the director of the Center on Disability and Inclusion. But I'm going to go back a little bit. When I was a graduate student at SU in the very early 2000s, I was one of the first members of the newly formed Beyond Compliance Coordinating Committee. At the time, we were working with, and to be clear, sometimes pushing very hard against, the university to improve access and climate for disabled students on campus. We were working to ensure that faculty provided the necessary accommodations in classes, that events were reasonably accessible, emphasis on the reasonably, and that disability was considered alongside other aspects of diversity. We felt like we kept going, and what about disability? And what about disability? And what about disability? It would have been hard to imagine then that we would have over 50 people registered for an event focused on creating a more neuro-affirming campus culture, and at 8:30 in the morning in July, no less. I have to admit, when we talked about this, I was like, well, I think we're gonna be lucky if 5 people are willing to take a July morning and come. So this is one of the reasons that why in my over 20 years here, one of the things I have loved most about this community is the desire to keep getting better, to keep asking what's next, and in creating a more inclusive and welcoming campus. And I want to thank all of you for being part of that. When we started the Neurodiversity at SU initiative through the generous support of Karen Siebold, we wanted to coordinate with existing programs and offices on campus to address needs that were identified by our neurodivergent students. Not to replace or supplant or create confusion, but to work with and coordinate. But when we asked students what they wanted and needed, 3 big themes emerged in that first year. More neuro-affirming opportunities for social connection, especially with other neurodivergent people. More sensory-friendly spaces on this campus. And professional development for faculty and staff to increase awareness of needs and strategies for ensuring a more positive campus climate in and out of the classroom, with a big emphasis a lot on residential and social spaces. So to that end, our initiative has worked to create sensory spaces, and a call that I have to say others on campus have enthusiastically taken up. There are sensory friendly spaces in the library. They're popping up in lots of places on campus. We have organized and continue to organize lots of social events, art making, sensory friendly ice skating, our neurodiversities drop-ins, which will probably get brought up later. It's a great name. And we've also been providing workshops and seminars here and at other campuses in New York State and across the country to help develop more neuro-affirming campus spaces. And we're doing research related to this work so that we can keep contributing to the knowledge base about neurodiversity in higher ed. But we are thrilled that you are all here to join us, to eat, to share, to learn from and with each other, and hopefully to build community as we build capacity, right? Like we really want to be working together to support each other. We want to know what else would help all of you in your current roles. We are working on building out programming and ideas for the coming year and would welcome your input. But now it is my pleasure to turn things over to two members of our team, doctoral candidates Nate Hughes and Sarah Petit-McClure. Nate and Sarah will introduce themselves, but I want to thank them for sharing their time and their experiences with all of us today. I would be remiss if I didn't say, you do you in this space. If you need to stand up and walk about, if you need to keep getting food because that fills you, whatever you need to do, we have a lot of room, take advantage of it. But I'm now going to turn things over to Nate and Sarah. I can't wait to hear the discussion. Thanks so much.
So are we starting with this? Okay. So again, this was the question that we encouraged you to write about as just kind of an introductory to topic to this main conversation that we're having about affirming, spaces for neurodiverse students on campus. The question was, in what ways do you currently support the range of students on campus in your role? This is something that we'll be coming back to a little bit later, but we just wanted to give you the opportunity to be able to just kind of think about this as we move forward. So, yep.
All right, so our goals and agenda for today. Oh, I'm trying to find the right spot to make it a good volume. All right, our goals and agenda for today. So our goals are to provide you all with an overview of considerations for neuro-affirming inclusivity on our campus, and then provide opportunities for reflection and discussion on how to center neuro-affirming practices in your particular role. As Christy mentioned, we're really excited that so many of you are here today, and there's so many people from all over campus with a wide variety of roles. For some of you who may have done a little bit more work and learning in this area, parts of this will be a review. For some of you, parts of it may be brand new. All of that is okay. If parts of this are a review for you, we welcome your help to help those who this information is newer to, help them get a deeper understanding, and also welcome your additions of practices that you've done that are helpful to that you found helpful to the neurodivergent community. Our agenda today, we're going to go through some introductions. We're going to do some framing our thinking about disability and difference to give a background of where we, Nate and I, but also the CDI more broadly, are coming from in this work. We're going to talk about barriers that exist on college campuses, and then we'll have an opportunity for reflection to relate back to support that you're already giving and think about support that you may be able to give in the future. Then we'll talk about what it means to create a neuro-affirming campus. And again, we'll have another opportunity for reflection and discussion. And then we'll end with questions and answers and share some resources for additional learning with you all. If at any point in time during this presentation you have a question, you have sticky notes in the middle of your table, and we have 2 different parking lots for questions. Feel free to jot a note on the sticky note and put it on one of the 2 parking lot posters. And again, do not feel bad about getting up at any point in time during this presentation. Get up and move. You will probably see me with this pen. This is like my favorite fidget in the world. With this pen in my hands the whole time because I can't not have something in my hands much of the time. So feel free to get up and put a question up at the end when we get to questions and answers or during the reflection and discussion times that we have. If those questions are relevant, then we can get to all of those questions. For those of you who are joining us on Zoom, We invite you to put questions that you have in the chat. And we do have Carly and Cecilia in the back helping with the Zoom room to make sure that you all are able to be a part of our questions and our discussions as we go forward. So we're going to start with introductions. This is me. My name is Sarah Petit-McClure. As Christy said, I'm a doctoral candidate here in the dissertation phase, working on inclusive special education. Up here, you see a picture of me with my family. This was a wonderful trip we took to Puerto Rico. But I put this picture up because I have many different identity categories that I am a part of, as all of you do, and as all of the folks on campus do. And part of that identity for me is an identity of neurodivergence. However, all of these pieces of who I am impact how I approach the work that I do, how I show up in spaces, and how I process the world. I have never had an official disability diagnosis. Likely, this is in part due to the fact that I'm female and in my mid-40s. Most disability diagnoses were not given to females unless it was intellectual disability or something along those lines. Like obviously Down syndrome was something that people knew about, but oftentimes that wasn't given to folks that were growing up female in my age. So at the same time that I benefited from not having a disability label, I was also hindered by that in many ways throughout my growing up. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but like my path through college, 7.5 years, 3 majors, 3 colleges. Not because I wasn't capable, but because I wasn't necessarily supported to be successful. And that's one of the things that I want to help others avoid here at SU and more broadly. So I'm excited that there's so many of you here today to learn about that in order to make this space a more welcoming and neuro-affirming place for our whole community. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Nate to introduce himself, and thank you all for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. My name is Nate Hughes. I am a doctoral candidate at Syracuse. I'm looking to finish at some point in the next few months. I am currently studying inclusive education. My research interests include both autistic perspectives, particularly in higher education, which is what the main topic of this here is today, as well as out-of-district placements, which are when school districts in the kindergarten through 12th grade system decide, that students are not able to be serviced, and and they decide to place them outside of the district as a result of that. And that's something that I'm looking for, causes of that and how to avoid that practice from taking place. But I digress. I identify as autistic. I was diagnosed at an very early age, about 2 years old, so which is a very different experience from Sarah, where I think that was both a benefit to me as well as, just something that kind of caused me to be marginalized in my childhood. I benefited from the early diagnosis in the sense where I knew of my identity at a young age and how to just kind of work through a non-neuro-affirming world, and I kind of had the chance to work on that over the course of my life. But at the same time, I was kind of like someone who was just placed in self-contained settings growing up, like just special education classes, and I wasn't really given the chance to be included a lot of the time in school. And that was something that really kind of set me as othered within the larger community. And so there really were, two sides to that coin. I've worked for 4 years at a local independent living center, working with high school students who are looking to gain independent living skills, reach their goals, primarily transition age students out who are looking to graduate from high school. I'm really excited about this presentation because when I entered college, it was very difficult for me, particularly in the residential piece. I had a lot of difficulty with roommates who didn't understand, neurodivergence and being autistic. And this was something that really kind of caused my college experience to not be what it could have been. And so I'm very optimistic about this presentation where I'm hoping that you all can take away how to make this particular space more inclusive, more welcoming, more neuro-affirming, so that all students can have a chance to be successful here. So that's me. It's nice to meet you all. I look forward to presenting today. So thank you. So, so now that we've introduced ourselves, I'd like to kind of take the chance to, well, Sarah and I would like to take the chance to get to know you all a little bit better. So we want to know specifically who's in the room with us, right? So what we're going to do, if you feel comfortable, we're going to kind of list some things off, and if any of this applies to you, just feel free to raise your hand. Is your work here mainly as a student at undergrad, graduate level? Raise your hand if that's the case. Great. So that's a few. Great. How about when it comes to interacting with students? Great. That's a pretty substantial number. That's awesome. How about planning events? Great. Excellent. A lot of coordinators here. I like that. What about as a teacher? Great. Fantastic. Supervising others? Excellent. So yeah, so so I see a few students, a lot of people who are in more faculty level or administrative level roles, so there's a good mix here, and I like that a lot. Um, so here, and this is something where this is only something if you feel comfortable with answering these questions, because this is something where we're going to get a little bit more just kind of relating to personal experiences that you may have had. These questions here, have you or someone you care about ever struggled with feeling supported on a college campus? Raise your hand. Great. And, how about, have you ever struggled with receiving support on campus if you've experienced difficulty or challenge, if that was something that you've kind of faced difficulty with on a college campus, or you or somebody you care about? So you can see that this is quite a common issue, which is why we feel that this topic that we're presenting on today is critical for ensuring that campuses are equitable and inclusive. So, I would appreciate, the vulnerability that you all shared with this exercise. It just kind of goes to really emphasize how, how much work still needs to be done. So.
So we wanted to start a little bit today by talking about framing our thinking and talking about how we think about disability and difference, both how we think about it and how it's sort of perceived in society at large. Often society applies a deficit lens to disability and difference. It's often unintentional and systems-based, but we have the power to disrupt that. And so one of our goals today is to help us all reflect on how we as individuals see difference and disability in our roles here in campus, and how we can disrupt some of the deficit lens that exists more broadly. In our work, we often use two main models of understanding disability. So over here, we have the medical model of disability. Some of you may be familiar with this. The medical model of disability is one that is commonly accepted in large parts of our society. And the medical model views disability as something that resides within the person, or in this case, the dog or cat creature, that individual is the problem, and that individual needs to be fixed or changed to fit into the system. The social model of disability pushes back on that and says the individual, here this froggish character, is not the problem. Instead, it's the barriers that society puts up for that person because of some part of the way that their brain or body works that is the problem. And so what we need to do instead of changing the person is change the barriers, remove the barriers, mitigate the barriers, minimize the barriers. So while much of our work has to do with disability, the CDI is the Center on Disability and Inclusion, we do not take this just to indicate people who have formal disability diagnoses. When we are talking about neurodivergence, we are talking much more broadly. And folks who are neurodivergent experience barriers in society in similar ways, whether or not they have a formal disability diagnosis. So one of the things that we think is helpful and important is to bring in voices of neurodivergent people beyond just ourselves. This is Li Xin Zhen Zhang Soon. They're widely published as Lydia X.C. Brown, and they're talking about, particularly in that bolded part there, they're talking about how the social model of disability relates to them and how they understand it as a disabled person. I am recognizing that my mind body function atypically, and that because of this, I am constantly forced by mainstream social and cultural attitudes and the laws and policies that enforce them to choose between being othered and then discriminated against or outright harmed, or accepting the idea that I must hide who I am by passing as an abled person. And so this is what we want to help push against. We don't want folks who identify as neurodivergent on our campus to feel that they either have to not be who they are and do the work to try to pass as an abled person or be discriminated against. We want to disrupt that. And now Nate's going to talk to you a little bit about neurodivergence.
All right. So, as thank you, Sarah. We're talking about understanding neurodivergence, right? So this larger conversation on neurodivergence really hinges on this overarching question of, what happens when we think of neurodiversity as the baseline for what we do, rather than something to be accommodated or even supported, for that matter, just something that's the baseline for, how things, institutions such as universities, for example, are operated. First, but in order to kind of get into this, we have to really define these two main topics first, right? So neurodiversity and, oh, yeah, absolutely.
Something I forgot in my intro. You all have handouts on your table, and I forgot to put that in when I went over the goals and agenda. I meant to refer to that. The first top page has these definitions and others. I apologize for interrupting, Nate. And then the second one we'll refer to a little bit, but a lot of that is more for your takeaway in the future. Sorry. Back to neurodiversity and neurodivergence.
So yeah, when it comes to understanding this question of neurodiversity as a baseline for what we do, we really have to consider the definitions of these two terms here. So neurodiversity and neurodivergence, or neurodivergent. So neurodiversity is the larger topic between these two. It acknowledges the natural diversity of our neurology for everybody. It recognizes that there's no correct form of neurology, no right way to think, no right brain. It's something that is just kind of acknowledges that everybody's neurologies are valuable and important to just kind of the larger goals of a community. It's something that, that applies to, a group, as opposed to, something that is neurodivergence, which applies more to individual or a group of individuals. And neurodivergence is something that was coined by Cassiana Sasumasu, I believe in the year 2000, which is much earlier than it's been used in this more mainstream conversation around the term neurodivergence. But it's actually a very inclusive term. It means, something that it's any kind of neurology that, that differs from, society's normative attitudes towards ways of thinking, ways of knowing, even ways of doing, and this is something that's kind of traditionally been pathologized through the lens of disability. But in actuality, it's more of it kind of goes into this larger conversation of neurology that is normative being more of a social construct that kind of relates more to the aspects of a community versus, something that's kind of right or wrong. And so that's where a lot of things such as ableism or discrimination based on disability come in. But it's related to disability, this term neurodivergence, but it's not interchangeable with the term disability for the reasons that I have just discussed. So, here we have we can kind of see how neurodivergence has been lumped in, historically with this larger concept of disability through this graphic here, this neurodivergence umbrella. you can see how some of the labels that have been traditionally associated with disability just kind of relate to different ways of thinking, ways of neurologies that maybe might differ from, like what like common societal norms, and how this is not like a deficit or something that's incorrect, but more just, more of a difference, for that should be acknowledged and valued. So for example, like things like autism, ADHD, OCD, like intellectual disabilities. These are all things that like have really been pathologized or kind of made to be medical within our society. But like in actuality, that's more of a construct that's kind of meant to really more or less make people shamed for like not following with this more cultural, social construct that really has promoted a lot of harm in our communities. And so this is something that we also have in our handout, as Sarah mentioned, this graphic, the neuro-affirming practices. These are just things that like we kind of think about as we mention, barriers that exist on our campus, for neurodivergent people. This is something that kind of incorporates some strategies for addressing these barriers, like each of these things on this little pyramid here. These are things that really drive our own thinking about how to support neurodivergent students on campus. Like these are things that we continually think about, right? Like while we would love to really go into depth about all of these, this is something like where we're very limited on time, and like this would actually be a workshop in and of itself to kind of go over each of these 11 topics that we have here. And so, in our handout, we can kind of see a brief description of each of them, as well as some of the resources that really go into how to support neurodivergent students with these kind of tenets in mind. Some links for some websites that really kind of talk about that.
One other thing about the handouts that I was supposed to mention is I believe they were all emailed to you ahead of time, so that if you need a larger font or things along those lines, you should be able to change those. Oh, they were not. They will be emailed to you. They will be emailed to you right now. So if you would like to access them digitally, you should be able to. Yes. 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 Thank you for that question. So when we think about going back to those models of disability and that understanding of neurodivergence, part of the reason that I think many of you are here is to learn about what barriers exist and what barriers neurodivergent students and staff experience on campus, and then some strategies for removing those. So Nate mentioned this term ableism. Ableism is a system of discrimination against folks who are disabled or perceived as disabled. Again, they may not have a disability label, but they may be perceived as disabled due to differences in the way that they interact with the world, and therefore they often are subject to ableism. Ableism can take the form of thoughts, actions, words, and also the ways that systems are created. What ableism looks like in these various spaces differs. So in social settings, ableism takes the form of neurotypical norms. Oh, that sounds better. Sorry, was I too quiet before? If you ever can't hear me, just let me know, because I feel like I moved the mic too much. Neurotypical norms are ways that we expect people to interact. So a neurotypical norm might, an example might be that we expect people to make eye contact when we're having a conversation with them. Neurotypical norms are culturally specific as well, right? What is a neurotypical norm here in the United States is different than what might be a neurotypical norm in another country. So there are ways in which culture intersects with disability and neurodivergence that impacts how people are perceived. In social settings, as Christy mentioned in her introduction, many neurodivergent students have mentioned that there's a lack of affinity groups and a lack of social opportunities that feel safe and comfortable for them to engage in as neurodivergent people. And then many universities, Syracuse University for sure, the large size makes it very challenging to meet people. Those are all barriers in social spaces that neurodivergent folks experience. In classroom spaces, instructional accessibility is a barrier. The ways in which classes are structured are not always conducive. Group work is sometimes very challenging for neurodivergent individuals, and group work is something that we as folks who study education talk about as great, and it is great. I'm not saying we shouldn't do group work. However, it sometimes makes it challenging for folks to participate in that. And then large lecture classes. Those are often spaces where students can get overwhelmed and lost. In terms of campus events, sometimes campus events don't meet the sensory needs of folks who are neurodivergent. One way of a neurotypical norm is that most folks who are neurotypical don't have issues with sensory integration, and therefore they're able to handle a variety of stimuli. Campus events, the promotional materials are not always accessible. The space is not always accessible, and it's not always presented in accessible formats. So these are some barriers that exist. I'm going to pass it to Nate to talk a little bit about a study that he and Dr. Ashby did that's soon to be published, I believe.
Yes, it is soon to be published. It'll be published in the next few months, I believe. This was a study that we completed at a large college campus, that is very similar to Syracuse. But it's something that, but it's something that, you know, but that it really does kind of relate to these larger ideas that Sarah was talking about how accommodation is important, not only important, but also necessary for students to feel welcome and to feel affirmed on such a large college campus. So as part of this study, we completed interviews, with, I believe it was 7 students, both at the undergraduate and graduate level, who each identified as neurodivergent. And they were each degree-seeking students, and we asked them about their experiences on campus. One of the things that we really found was that there was a lot of stigma around not just neurodivergence, but the broader implications associated with disability, that we mentioned earlier, when it came to asking for support in all realms of the college experience, whether this was academically, in terms of extracurricular activities, residential living, it was something that really, these fears of ableism, and whether this was trauma relating to, their previous educational experiences in high school or middle school, or, even things that they've experienced on campuses, on college campuses. This is something that they felt were barriers that caused students to hesitate to ask for support and accommodations. In addition, this was something that students battled in combination with this deep-rooted desire for a sense of belonging. Each student found spaces that they found comfortable in that didn't necessarily relate to affinity groups related to disability or neurodivergence, such as drama, LGBTQ affiliated groups. However, there was really a deep-seated desire among every student who we interviewed that really that related to just kind of finding that space, that affinity space, that where neurodivergent students can connect and really feel that they were part of a larger community that could support one another within this massive campus, where maybe the social atmosphere wasn't always conducive to neurodivergent body minds, things like large social events like parties or Greek organizations, for example. And lastly, there was an expressed need for advocacy, both in support for self-advocacy, as well as advocacy to administrators, faculty, for more affirming, more inclusive classroom spaces, campus environments, et cetera, as well as understanding that making these changes to the campus community would benefit everybody, not just students who identify as neurodivergent, but it would also make things more welcoming, more accepting for neurodivergent students as well. So just kind of thinking about how in other words, just thinking about how the universities within the United States, and even internationally, have really centered this idea of neurotypicality in their structures, and it's something that we kind of found that students often critiqued, and that they would like to see just more of a affirming environment. Oh yeah, yes I am. Oh no, no worries. So just thinking about the introductory free write that you did, and if you didn't do it, it's totally fine. This is your time to maybe think about some of these questions as well. Just thinking about how to how to just think about some of the barriers that you are already addressing as part of your role in the university. Um, what other barriers, right, might still need to be addressed in your role or your department. This is what we want you to think about right now. Like, as you think about what you are already doing, and as you think about what needs to be done, like, what are some of those things, right? So we would like for you to log on to Padlet if you can, and maybe, and there's a QR code on the handout. Thank you very much. There, there's also a QR code on the slideshow that you can utilize. And you'll have about 5 minutes to maybe contribute to that. And then we'll have a few minutes to share out for anybody who feels comfortable doing so. Is everybody else all set with these things? Or anybody have any questions? Yes, yeah. Yep. So anybody have any questions before we get started? All right. Well, we'll come back in about 5 minutes or so. Great. We see some people contributing. Excellent. Oh, yeah, like that. It's like in Google Docs, like the same thing. Yeah, I don't think I have it. Yes. So
Can I
they ask
talk
for
about why we use Padlet since it's the dual format, but also let them know that they can use these things in class?
what do you like to work for?
Or we're doing it in Zoom, so this allows for people.
Okay.
But can you talk about that before you go over some of the answers?
Right.
Okay.
So I was like phone out. So does everybody need more time, or do you think we're good to go? Everybody good? Thumbs up. All right. So there were two reasons why we used Padlet. One was because it has a dual format, so that it was very so like we could be inclusive of our friends who used Zoom, as well as the people who participated in person. As well as, this is something that can also be used in classroom settings, especially for people who might not feel as comfortable sharing out, like in class verbally, or like people who like prefer to type to communicate. It's something that is really a real asset for classroom conversations. So those are two kind of things we wanted to really highlight as part of the use of, as per the use of Padlet. So does anybody have any thing that they want to share out that they contributed?
So I'm a PhD student, and in the class ITA, we do a survey at the start of every semester that we explicitly introduce as like, we want to know how best to support you. And these are questions that like, I wish I had been asked. What does it look like when you're paying attention in class? Because I almost failed stats because I was always doing Sudoku puzzles. I was listening, but I didn't look like I was. So what does it look like when you're paying attention? What does it look like when you're lost or struggling? What is most like, what is your learning style? What is your preferred mode of participation? And so we get all of this on like week 1 when a student doesn't add 2 weeks in. So then I'm like, okay, we've just passed the first assignment of the semester, we're 6 weeks in. I have no idea if this student is learning. I can look back at that survey and be like, okay, well, no, they told me that they don't take notes, they record the lecture. So the fact that I've never seen them write anything down, I'm less concerned. We also kind of just have open questions like, is there anything else you want us to know? And students will share things like, I had a student who's like, yeah, I live an hour away and I'm working 2 jobs. I'm like, that's really important for me to know. That's going to impact my perception of your participation in this course. Survey, highly recommend.
Thank you. And I really appreciate what you. Oh,
Sorry, how many students? So it is a course of about 60 students with 3 TA sections of 20 or fewer.
thank you. I just was going to say, I really appreciate what you said about, like the question about like, how does it look when you pay attention? Because, traditionally, like, this was something that I always struggled with when I was like an undergrad, like in college. Just thinking about like cold calling, like that's how they traditionally like assess whether somebody's paying attention or not. Like they'll just call on you at random sometimes. And that was always anxiety provoking for me. So just kind of figuring that out in advance, like how it looks when someone's paying attention, that's like, that can avoid that stressful component of it. So, that's great.
So anybody else would like to share out either a way that they are already mitigating barriers in their particular role, or a barrier that they see that they could mitigate in their role, and maybe they're not sure how to do that yet. So up here, we see, I don't know how close I can get to that other mic. We see, no, I don't want you to run away. We see that there are people who provide a variety of meeting modalities and spaces. We see folks sharing their own experience as making it a more welcoming for others who may have that neurodivergent experience as well. We see ideas about flexible hours for scheduling and helping students with accessibility requests for what they need in the classroom. And then as far as barriers that you all notice we still need some more assistance with, we see hustle culture, that expects endless productivity and drastically limits time to care for body and mind. That is absolutely true. We see like education and awareness building for staff and faculty. That's why we're really glad that you're here today, because that is a barrier to students' participation on campus. Equitable access to remote work, right? And that impacts probably both neurodivergent students and neurodivergent faculty and staff. Inclusive meal options. Support with independent living. Facilitation of group work with consideration for neurodiversity, including consideration for students who are neurodivergent, but may not be fully aware of their needs. That's a big part of being a college student, right? Is figuring out who you are and what your needs are. And if we're in a neuro-affirming spaces, we're helping support that growth rather than inhibit or make people feel shame as they go through that growth. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, absolutely. So, just kind of like thinking about like, the one thing that really stands out to me here is inclusive meal options, because for me, like I have a very limited diet just because of like my sensory needs. I struggle with texture and taste sometimes. And so just kind of thinking about that, as a general rule, like that's something like not just for like people like me who have kind of like that these needs, like, but just people who have like diets like for other reasons, you know what I mean, whether it's things like vegetarianism or like just kind of like religious like needs, like, or like anything that like relates to diet. Like it's something that like I really want to emphasize is that supporting neurodivergent students in regards to accessibility really benefits everybody. That's something that I really like want to consider. These aren't like things that like I that are intended to provide special like supports or accommodations for a single group of people. It's something that's ultimately meant to like really enrich the college experience and that identity exploration that Sarah was talking about, in order to really just promote like successful growth and interdependence as that transition to adulthood takes place.
So now that we've identified some of the barriers, and just like the neurodivergent umbrella and the things that fall under it is not an exhaustive list, our list of barriers is definitely, even with input from all of you, not an exhaustive list, right? We need to constantly be thinking about what barriers might exist and how to address them. So we want to share a little bit with you about what it means to have a neuro-affirming campus. What does this vision mean? A neuro-affirming campus is making room for all people by minimizing barriers and filling gaps. It is a work in progress. It is something that constantly needs to be done. This makes sure that there's space for faculty, staff, and students who are neurodivergent with and without a formal disability label or a formal mental health diagnosis. A neuro-affirming campus oh, sorry, that was my timer from discussion. Yes. A neuro-affirming campus vision also includes having faculty and staff who understand neurodivergence. And so your presence here is helpful in building that. But we saw that many people see that as a barrier that still exists on our campus. This vision makes space for people who are neurocurious. So on your handout, we have a definition of neurocuriosity. And then there's also For anyone who wants more information about neurocuriosity, there's an additional flyer in the back as well. So neurocurious folks are people who want to learn more about neurodivergence as they explore their own identity. That used to be sort of where I felt like I fell, and then that shifted over to identifying as neurodivergence. And then we also make space for allies of disabled and neurodivergent people. So to do all this, we need to move beyond a neurotypical centered approach. So we've heard, like Nate talked a little bit about what that means as far as a neurotypical centered approach. So some ways that we can do that is centering lived experiences of neurodivergent people. Another way we can do it is by planning with universal design in mind. So we often hear about universal design in classroom spaces, but universal design can apply in a variety of spaces, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then, as we've noted today, ongoing opportunities for learning about disability and diversity are needed, right? And so part of having a neuro-affirming campus is having ongoing opportunities for learning. Sorry, still me. So centering lived experiences, conversation is key. We need to make sure that we are having intentional dialogue with folks, not to put them on the spot. And Padlet is actually a great way to get input from people about things without putting them on the spot. It's got all sorts of cute names, like, what was the one you said, Sam? Something capybara? Like, it was, yeah, supportive capybara, right? So you can get input from folks without them having to put themselves out there in ways that might make them feel uncomfortable. But seeking that dialogue and that input is important. We mentioned a little bit before about intersectional solidarity, and that's one of the principles on your second handout is intersectionality. So race, gender, class, language, other identity markers all impact the experiences that people have. They impact access to diagnosis, and they impact access to support. So it's important that we make sure that we're making space for that when we're having these conversations. And then those conversations should be aimed at understanding how neurodivergence impacts the student and work experience on campus, right? It's not so much about how campus functions as it is about how the individuals are functioning on campus and what support they need to access various parts of campus.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So kind of thinking about examples, like specific, like higher education related examples of centering lived experience. Here are like three options, like just like a few examples. This isn't an exhaustive list, but some like three examples of how this can look. The first has to do with the advising process for, like the academic path that a student might take. Flexible formats are very beneficial, whether this is in person or remote, especially when a lot of these meetings are very high stakes when it comes to the states of the progress that the student's making towards completing a degree. Or the requirements for their major, conversations about that, which can be sometimes difficult. So like kind of keeping like physical accessibility in that regard in mind is critical. Also, and on that note, it's important to maybe be open about students maybe needing more time to complete academic requirements, because there's a lot of pressure a lot of the time for students to complete a program in 4 years, for example. Whereas students might feel like less stress, or their mental health might improve when they're taking a bit of a smaller course load, or they might finish like a semester or two later than than what the expectation is for a 4-year program. And that's totally fine, because it's about being able to complete quality work as you work towards a degree, not trying to pressure yourself to the point where a lot of students tend to end up leaving college altogether because of that. So that's why I think that's critically important. Also, the residential experience, which is something that I had a lot of difficulty with, as I had alluded to in my introduction. I think there's still a lot of work to do when it comes to making these spaces neuro-affirming, such as dorms and maybe like apartments for like upperclassmen that are owned by the university. Just things like flexible room choices, for example, where where students like as it's available, because it's not always available. I do recognize that. Like I had for the most part in my college experience had a single room, where I didn't have roommate, and that was something that, like, especially on a large college campus, really gave me a bit of reprieve from like the like just kind of the overwhelming like hustle and bustle of the the larger campus, attending class, having to do work, and then having to come back to a roommate would have been really difficult for me. So just kind of keeping that in mind. In addition to floor meetings, which is something that like really happens once in a while if you're living in a dorm. For those of you who hadn't lived in a dorm in your college experience, this is something that happens where like the whole floor of a dormitory will get together and talk about like issues that are taking place in the dorm, or even like kind of like procedures for like leaving for breaks. Like thinking about like how it's going to work. And so those can be kind of disruptive to a routine, especially if like you're on a large campus and you're already overwhelmed, and that can be kind of difficult to. And so accessibility in that regard, like Sarah and I kind of thought that this was something that was very important to consider too, even though like it's something that's doesn't happen all the time, but it's also something to keep in mind. Lastly, events, like just large college events, these can be very, just can be, I mean, just because there's so many people and so much like noise and so much stimulation, this can be very inaccessible for students who are neurodivergent sometimes. So just kind of like participant input for what's needed for accessibility, like as these events are being planned, can be essential, like just so like these events are not offering accommodations, but like these needs are considered from the forefront and centered as part of the planning process. This is something that can make things like inclusive and enjoyable, for everybody. And just kind of think about some of those types of events as well, that can be engaging, like, and while, just so that all students kind of feel like they have a place to go and be part of the larger community.
So one of the things Nate mentioned is like planning from the start, not just making accommodations for individual students. And of course, accommodations for individual students absolutely should be made. And at the same time, less of that is required and more people benefit when there's also planning from the start. And that's where UDL comes in. So universal design talks about 3 different main access points. Universal design asks us, as folks who are considering this, to consider how information or content is presented and shared and provide it in multiple ways. So multiple means of representation. Right now, we have the handouts that have been mailed to you digitally. We have us talking, we have the PowerPoint presentation, and we have CART. That is not exhaustive. There are a variety of different things that could be done, right? But that's an example of multiple means of representation. Engagement, again, we want to aim for multiple means of engagement. So how will students engage or interact in that space or with that material? And then communication is something that's really important, right? We as human beings, even those of us who need a lot of time to ourselves, still are social creatures and want to be heard and understood. And so providing multiple means of expression, thinking about how students will communicate, participate, share information is really important. Thank you. So some ways to do that are to provide choice. Regardless of what area of campus you are working in, as much choice as can be provided is helpful. Increasing student voice, or for those of you who may have a supervisory role for staff or faculty, increasing opportunities for them to give their input as well in ways that are productive to helping the team that you're working with work better together. And then providing accessibility information. So when there is something happening, or when you're thinking about residential life, right? Providing accessibility information about what people can expect. one of the things that we've talked about a little bit is like sensory needs. And it is important to know that some people's sensory needs conflict with other people's sensory needs. And that's a big challenge, right? And so providing information about what is going to exist, how you access it, those kinds of things can help people make decisions about whether or not they want to engage in that space, or if they need to request a different way to engage in that space. If they don't know what to expect, they may just avoid it altogether. And so providing that accessibility information is important. Is this me as well? Okay. So the last piece of this that we're talking about in a neuro-affirming campus vision is ensuring that there's opportunities for ongoing learning about disability and diversity. And Nate and I put that into two buckets. These are not, again, as with everything, these are not the only ways to think about it, right? But we put this into two buckets: campus-wide events, where everyone is able to learn more about disability and diversity and neurodivergence, and then specific affinity groups for folks who identify in a certain way and are there for that, for getting support. So campus-wide events might be disability pride events. They might mean inviting disabled speakers, and think intersectionally about that, not just male white disabled speakers, or neurodivergent speakers on a variety of topics, not just talking about neurodivergence or disability, but on a variety of topics. Including disabled students and staff in the planning of events to increase accessibility, and promoting IPSE, which is inclusive post-secondary education events that happen on campus. For us, those are Inclusive U. And so promoting those beyond just Inclusive U when they are events that are open to everyone. And then when we think about affinity groups, that's folks who identify in a certain way, meeting together in order to either advocate communally or learn together or receive support. So affinity groups might do things like discuss about access to services. Sometimes it's overwhelming to figure out how you get what you need. And so if you have a space where you can talk to other people about how they access it, you can learn from that. And it might feel safer if you're with people who are also accessing that same support. Folks in those groups can share suggestions and tips for navigating campus, classes. They can provide affirming support with executive functioning, study skills, time management. And the key word there is affirming support, because sometimes when support is provided by folks who don't really understand, that may feel a little bit shaming, versus affirming support where everyone is sort of seeking that support of some sort together and helping each other find that. And then participation in activities that are commonly enjoyed by whoever the neurodivergent students in that affinity group are, right? So sometimes it feels safer when you know that certain situations are hard for you to go with a group, and that group can advocate for what their needs are in that particular event. Sometimes that feels safer. And so affinity groups and making space for affinity groups are important ways to continue the ongoing learning on campuses.
Thank you. So some more things to keep in mind, is the fact that disability is a form of diversity. It is a natural part of the human condition. Almost everybody, if not everybody, will experience disability at some point in their lifetime. And so, and because of that, in turn, neurodivergence is also a natural part of human neurodiversity. Because neurodivergence historically has been aligned with, this larger concept of disability, which is why I wanted to kind of bring that topic into that space. Just kind of like, this is why it's essential, as Sarah discussed, to just kind of like bring like events to the table, for students who are disabled, or who all identify as neurodivergent, neurodivergent, to kind of develop clubs or organizations or events, just to kind of find that sense of community that Sarah mentioned, like that sense of, belonging and, just a supportive space, to help, kind of get through, the higher education experience. And so you can see here on this slide, there are a few examples of what's been offered on the SU campus. We have a disability cultural center, which is meant to provide, events, programming, support, just, assistance, for students who identify as disabled. We also have Disability Pride Month, every year, where students, there are a variety of events and celebrations and, programs, offered during that month to celebrate disability and the, and the brilliance of disability, and just kind of thinking about just people who identify as having disabilities were accomplish, like both here and throughout our international community. Lastly, we have neurodiversity, which is something that I've played an active role in, organizing and facilitating, where this usually happens like at the end of this day once a week, end of one of the academic days, where students who identify as neurodivergent can come together, kind of relax, unwind after the long, stressful day of academics, and have some tea, maybe play a board game or two, have a conversation about about anything really. And it's not structured. That's like the one key thing that I like to mention is that it's not something that imposes, an activity structure or an organization or routine. It's just a space for relaxation and for just kind of expressing ourselves, faculty who are facilitate included, as a just kind of like a free space for neurodivergent joy. So just thinking about this, in regard to accessibility, for how students tap into some of these opportunities, right? How do these opportunities get shared, right? Because is it done from like an authoritative way where faculty say like, oh, I recommend that you go to the DCC or that you do the neurodiversity, or are students kind of playing a role as well to maybe kind of like kind of share information, in a more kind of like natural way, like among like themselves, among peers, as well, to kind of thinking about like how that gets shared, because like one of the things that we found is that like students when especially undergraduate students, like when they share information, students are more likely to really partake in it and more likely to maybe participate, because it's something that is seen as, valid among one's peer group, and something that we really and kind of promoting that sense of neurodiversity and just among one's peers is something that we really value. Also just considering accessibility, like because like is there a certain time of day that works for some of these events, right? Is there a certain day of the week? Like we have to really be considerate of like what periods tend to be more stressful, where students might not want to attend an event, like other than like academic classes, just thinking about like how one's schedule, especially with an extensive workload, which is what we expect in higher education, like might impact one's ability to participate, especially for neurodivergent students who might find really some of these events like especially overwhelming when having to navigate inaccessible, like classroom spaces on occasion, and having they might need some time to unwind like outside of external events. So thinking about accessibility, like you have to kind of go through this whole like three-dimensional view of the student experience. That's what I kind of recommend for that. So this is me as well, I think. Yep. So there are kind of some more examples of what we feel to be a neuro-affirming campus. And we kind of divided this into three different categories. Social settings, classroom spaces, as well as campus events. And I'm going to be providing a few examples for each domain here. So the first is social settings. One of the things that we find to be beneficial for a neuro-affirming campus are, like, this is something that we've kind of repeated a couple times, but I'm going to say it again because it's so important. Just kind of a diverse range of activities or clubs for students who have varied interests, rather than kind of trying to kind of force students into a single box based on what's available. And in turn, because of that, like what naturally follows is support for student-initiated activities, which is something we've also mentioned, for students who might try to. So that kind of offers space for students to try to find peers who might have interests in common and kind of develop those bonds and rapport and kind of friendships, and lastly, kind of like I mentioned, accessible living spaces with room for student input and with what works best for them. Classroom spaces, this is where some new ideas are getting introduced, and I think they're critical. So statements on syllabi for accommodations and kind of having professors be open to discussion around accommodations that work best for individual students. That kind of openness kind of shows a sense of care within the higher education space, especially for students who are just entering college for the first time. It's something that really shows students that they should feel comfortable with advocating for what works best for them, and and kind of like thinking about like how things can be adjusted to meet student needs while still maintaining that academic rigor that defines higher education. And in turn, like just kind of like being flexible with kind of deadlines or dates, like kind of not excusing from assignments, obviously, but like just kind of making sure that students have what they need in order to be able to meet the academic expectations in ways that don't really center neurotypicality, which is what higher education has traditionally done when it comes to assignments and exams.
Can I add something real quick, Nate?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So one thing about that idea of faculty being open to conversation and putting a statement on their syllabus that's important to keep in mind is that complying with what CDR, the Center, Center for Disability Resources, yes? Is that correct? Okay, sorry. So with being compliant with what they have on their letter that faculty get does not mean that you can't do more, right? So it may not say flexible deadlines, or it may say something like extensions given of like 2 days for papers, something along those lines, right? But through individual conversations, faculty can choose to do a different format that might work better for the student than what is in that accommodation letter. And so in that syllabus statement, having really making an open invitation to come talk with the professor about what that looks like for you, because a lot of those are forms from like, it's a similar category of accommodation, right? And so being open to having conversations with individual students about what that looks like for them goes beyond just compliance and really gets at that idea of neuro-affirming actions. So thank you for letting me add that.
Well, absolutely. Oh, go ahead. Oh, you're raising your hand. Go ahead.
Just to add to that, students should not need a letter to prove that they need accommodation.
Definitely.
Like it took me so long to get an ADHD diagnosis. I did not have a letter saying that I needed things. So if a student comes to you and says, this is what I'm struggling with and this is what I think will help, your job is to say, okay, let's work on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And also here in our CDR, you don't have to have a formal diagnosis in order to get an accommodation letter, but you also don't need an accommodation letter to get the accommodations if faculty are open to that. So thank you for bringing that up.
Absolutely. So our last category here is campus events. We've already talked about this a little bit in detail, but one of the things I do want to mention is the orientation process for when students first kind of come on campus. It's usually like this big, like massive event with like they're celebrating like, oh, welcome to, such and such university or such college. And that's something that for me was especially intimidating because I was trying to get used to the space and there was like all this like, kind of like this exuberance and, like just kind of like all these activities for team building and getting to know each other. And I was just trying to get used to the physical space, so that, and I kind of like, I've heard that's very similar to a lot of students who identify as neurodivergent have had similar experiences with that introductory process. And so kind of thinking about accessibility in that way, I think is important.
So we gave a few examples, but we would like you to take some time at your table. And as we mentioned before, you all have a variety of different roles. So think about in your role, like turn and talk about some strategies that we no back sorry yeah that we might not have gotten in these particular categories if any of these categories fit your role. So what else might it look like in a neuro-affirming campus that we didn't add that you in your role could do or already do in social settings, classroom spaces, or campus events? So we're going to take probably like 3 or 4 minutes at your table and just talk at your table. If you are on Zoom, we would love for you to share your ideas with each other in the chat so that you also get the benefit of hearing from others and sharing your ideas. That's what it is. Yes. Yep. No, I totally understood. It's gonna ding in a minute. It's gonna ding in 3 seconds.
3 seconds. All right. Okay, everybody. So if we could return, I'm just wondering if anybody has anything that they would like to share out about what you talked about. All right, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Morgan, and I work in our Career Services Department for the School of Information Studies. So I'm working with undergraduate and graduate students find jobs, which in itself can already be very stressful. So something in my office that I stated, I do have a lamp, so I will shut off like either the overhead lighting and I'll have kind of less harsh lighting. But something I'm going to add into my office is to have like a basket of kind of take what you need type of things. So whether that's a fidget toy, whether that's those Neato squishies, whether it's gum, or mints, or even snacks, because something about just offering something to eat. A lot of my students, just even whether it's neurodivergent or neurotypical, forget to eat. You're on a college campus, you're running from class, you're running places. So just having a little basket that they can take from so that they're leaving feeling more fulfilled.
Absolutely. Thank you. And for me, I know for me too, like as an autistic person, I think like having like like food, like while I'm like talking with somebody can allow me to have like the sensory input, like that allows me to stimulate myself and have the conversations that I need to have with whatever like administrator or just whatever meeting I'm in. I think like just kind of like having that allows me to kind of focus more and like not be like as overstimulated because it kind of gives my sensory needs to be met through the taste. So I like that. Anybody else? I'll go ahead.
All right. So we talked at our table, and there were a couple things that I thought of, one that was classroom based and one that was sort of workspace based. And classroom space, related to the statement on the syllabus and open to self-advocacy, I think partnered with that is something actually, Sarah, you mentioned earlier in the presentation, but this idea of faculty or graduate students, whoever's leading the class, modeling sort of talking about the things they need. I always will tell students, hey, here's the thing. I wander around the class a lot. Sorry, I don't stand still real well. Or I often will tell students, I'm really sensitive to perfume. So if you come in my space and you have it on, I'm probably going to walk away from you because I can't breathe. But doing that to try to help students feel more comfortable, recognizing it doesn't have to be a formal accommodation to be something that makes someone's experience of a space safer. But the other thing is we've been, we all many of us work up on the 3rd floor in Huntington Hall, and it is a busy and very loud space a lot of the time. And some of us struggle with that. So one of the things that we have been working on is trying to carve out some spaces that are flexible use spaces that are intentionally quiet. And so I think about for people who are more on the staff or working space, trying to think of, can you carve out an office that is flex, that somebody could go in and hopefully have some sensory things in there, but that people can just go to that if they need to get away from chaos a little bit. So those were just a couple things we talked about. And if you want to come check out our really nice space on the 3rd floor, come visit us.
Thank you. Anyone else have anything that they would like to share from their table's discussion?
So one of the things that I talked about from CDR was getting enough accommodations for each individual class and then just emailing the professor from there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it is so helpful when individuals email the professor from that CDR letter, because then the professor can actually have that connection and know how that student is interpreting what's on that CDR letter and make sure that they're on the same page. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Oh,
sorry, go ahead, Nate.
I was just going to add to that. Like one of the things that like me and Dr. Ashby kind of found in our work was that like, when it comes to accommodation letters, it doesn't, a lot of the accommodations, I think you alluded to this as well, is that, a lot of the accommodations are very generalized. And whereas, like different classes have different requirements, for example, like an art-based class might require different accommodations than a history class, or like, when it comes to like the forms of assessment that are used. And so that's something else that to consider. But go ahead. Anyone have any other things to add? I'm sorry.
Just someone on Zoom, Dammy shared, being more intentional about asking students what they need rather than making assumptions.
Yeah, I heard a lot of people say yes and be excited about that. And that's so true, right? Like that comes back to that idea of conversation is key, right? We can't assume things without conversation and know that we're accurate. So the last thing that we want you to do before we open it up for the Q&A, and I'm so excited there's some questions on the parking lot already. Feel free to add anything to the parking lot as you are doing this, or add any questions in the chat. But what is something new that you will do in your role? And you led us to this perfectly over here at this table. Thank you for doing that. Something new that you will do in your role that will help us all work towards a neuro-affirming campus, because this is not something that one person can do alone or one department can do alone. This is something that a variety of people in a variety of spaces need to do. So again, we have a QR code up here. If you have the digital handout, there is a link on there, and there's a QR code on, it's the second QR code on the handout that is not printed in color. That's a good way to differentiate the two handouts. So what is something new that you will do in your role that will help work towards a neuro-affirming campus?
How many minutes?
That's a good question. Want to do 3 minutes and
Yep,
then we'll
so,
discuss
about
and do Q&A?
Yeah, we'll come back in about 3 minutes. All right. Thank you so much. So these are all like really great responses. Unfortunately, we're running a bit short on time. But like these are all like incredible. It really does seem like you're all thinking towards creating neuro-affirming campuses. So like I'm actually really proud that of all of you for that. Let's see. So one of the things that we want to kind of impress is that creating a neuro-affirming campus takes time. It's something that you might not get 100% like right on the first try, but like the important thing that like we want to kind of for you all to consider is that it's progress, right? Nobody's perfect. Like these are all like the kind of things that we just want you all to consider in that regard: inclusive classes, academic advising that affirms diversity, inclusive residential living, diverse opportunities for social life, clubs, and organizations. And as long as you continue to work towards making these things as accessible and affirming as you possibly can, you're on the right track.
So in the PowerPoint presentation, which you have been sent or will be sent, There are a variety of resources, but we like to really encourage you to learn from, like, that last slide talked about all guided by neurodiverse voices. We like to encourage you to learn from neurodivergent authors. And so we put a few examples up here. There are a ton more, but here are some neurodivergent authors. There are also some resources with links on, you want to go to the next slide? And then there are a few lending libraries here on campus if you want to borrow any books related to neurodivergence. And then I think with that, we will open it up to Q&A. We have some questions from the parking lot that I think we'll start with, and then we'll bring the microphone around for anyone who wants to ask questions out loud. And if there's questions that come up in the chat, we will be notified of those and can answer those as well.
All right. So the first question that I'll read says, what are some of examples of difficulties faced in large lecture courses by neurodivergent students? This is a great question because this is something where a lot of neurodivergent students do face difficulties when, and I think the most, kind of like relevant answer to this is the size of the class, just kind of being crowded into a large lecture hall where I think like there's not a lot of room for seating a lot of the time, especially for larger kind of general courses. And so that can be a bit overwhelming, overstimulating, and it's not as easy to focus in that regard. It's also just kind of accessibility for the professor. I know that in large lecture-based courses, there's TAs that you can ask for help. But like if there's something that that needs like a larger response than what the TA can provide, that can be a bit difficult sometimes. I don't know if you have any other questions. I mean responses to that.
Well, I think that idea of sometimes in the large lecture format, if accessibility is not thought about ahead of time, it can be hard to know how to accommodate for what you need because you don't have a close connection with the individual who's leading that necessarily. It's much harder to, right? When there's 150, 300 people in the class. That can be a big challenge because if accessibility is not built in from the beginning, it might be challenging to know how and who to talk to about that. So this is something that I talked about a little bit earlier. It says, how do we address conflicting needs and barriers? So for example, some things may be sensory inclusive for some and maybe overstimulating for others. And that is a huge challenge. One thing that we talked about was getting input from the folks who plan on attending, right? So planning with enough advance notice that and clear methods for people to communicate what they need in that particular space or event. And then also making it clear what's going to happen so they can determine if they need to ask for something different or if they need to choose to not participate in that thing. And we want to make everything as accessible to everyone who wants to go, but that doesn't mean that we have to require everyone to go, right? People have choice in what they attend. And so if it's something that's required for a class, then yes, absolutely, we need to make sure that there's a way for them to access that. If it's a social event, they may decide that that's not up their alley. And hopefully, in a neuro-affirming campus, we have other options socially that do fit better with what their needs are. The problem is when there's not options.
Absolutely. So the next question says, what are some approaches to group work that take neurodivergence into account? Great question. Because in my own life, I've actually met, I've had friends who identify as autistic and who have actually left college specifically because of the group work dynamic. And so like one of the things is that that would really help is acknowledging that if a group member doesn't speak as much during like these collaborative sessions, it doesn't mean that they are not working as hard or that they are like putting the work on other people. It's more that the person might be trying to process the information that's being shared. They might be wanting to maybe like work in a different way, like maybe like type responses to collaborative work sessions, or maybe like kind of like do more of like the actual like the the physical work, like if it's a PowerPoint or like whatever it is, like they might play a more active role in that regard. But like speaking in a large group scenario like that might be more nerve wracking. Just kind of having that acknowledgement, I think, could be helpful. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think talking with the class as a whole about different roles that folks can take in group work so that it's not, well, this group, you have a person in it that isn't comfortable talking, so that person doesn't have to talk, don't make them talk. Instead, it's here's a variety of roles that in this group project people could take. Discuss with your group what role they might feel most comfortable taking and giving time for that in that group work, but making those roles pretty clear. I don't know if you said this, Nate, because I was looking at the next question. Sorry. But also, you may have said this, just making it optional and hoping that you can have a conversation if people opt out about why they might be opting out, not the assignment, but on doing it with a group, right? And having that conversation that encourages them. No one lives in a bubble, right? We all have to work with other people, and part of college is growth. And so having that conversation with them in a non-shaming and affirming way that pushes that growth while also allowing them to be successful in the class if they're not ready for that growth yet. It's a tricky balance, but it requires an individual conversation. Which one do you want to do? Okay. What are the best ways to address the lack of affinity groups when there are barriers like stigma and relying on students to self-identify? That's a really great question. Nate, I really appreciated your answer to this when we talked about it back there. Do you want to go first and then
Absolutely.
I'll add?
So I think just kind of like focusing on inclusion in the broader sense, thinking about, or in diversity, those two topics, like in the broader sense, and the kind of reducing stigma in general of individual differences can ultimately really just kind of like result in more openness for reducing stigma for neurodivergence. It's just kind of like thinking about like creating a larger culture of diversity and inclusion, can really result in, just marginalization declining in general. And so kind of like riding that wave with regard to, destigmatizing, neurodivergence, that can just kind of like making sure the culture is there from the beginning, kind of that universal design piece.
And I also think, to add to that, when you are in a role where you interface with students, if you are able to build relationships with those students, they may feel comfortable self-identifying to you, even if they don't want to do so broadly. And therefore, you may be able to talk with them about what support they might need or what affinity group they might be looking for. And obviously, to join that affinity group, they would have to disclose whatever to that group. But I think knowing that there's staff and faculty support for forming those types of groups in a more inclusive environment is helpful. Does anybody else have any? This was a question I was like, this is a really great one that we really need to think about as we're doing this. And so I'd love if anyone else has something to add.
I would just give a shameless plug for one of the things that our neurodiversity initiative has done a really great job of is hosting these neurocuriosity events, and the idea of thinking you can be part of an affinity group as an ally, as somebody who's just interested in the topic, who wants to understand neurodiversity differently. And I think so framing these things not about nobody has to disclose anything about their own identities, but if you are interested in having conversations around this topic, that can invite people to the table that may then decide, hey, there's actually something valuable I might get out of a more of a different sort of identity recognition. I also think people are much more open to talking about this if there's representation of neurodiversity in the things that they're reading and learning about. Right. If it is just much more normalized. So.
Thank you. Anybody else have anything they want to add on that one? All right. I think we have one more from the parking lot.
All right. So this question says, how do students find the neurodivergent events offered on campus, and where should we look to find them? Great question. So if you look around, if you look around the Huntington building, as well as the CDR Center for Disability Resources, you'll see flyers for some of these events. You can also look on social. Oh, you can also look on this table. Exactly. Yeah, case in point. I was talking more about like the broader campus, but yeah, like there too, definitely. You can also reach out to any of us, and we can we'll be more than happy to provide you with information resources. We have social media. We have an Instagram account. We have just like a bunch of like different ways. We have a listserv for the CDI. Yeah. So like there's like a whole plethora of ways to find out about events and what's happening. And if you have any additional questions about this, like after this, maybe you can we'd be more than happy to answer any questions you might have about any specific event. So yeah, thank you for that question.
So are there questions that people would like to, we've got about 5 more minutes. Are there questions that people would like to ask out loud, or anything that's come up in the chat? Are there any new learnings that people are like, I really want to share this out loud because I think this will benefit other people? Do you have something? Question, perfect.
Oh, question, yeah.
Just a minor question, and it just popped into my mind at the beginning. With your comment, contrasting your experience with the early childhood diagnosis versus yours with the no adult level diagnosis. So what fraction of our current students received an early diagnosis, and how has that sort of changed over time? I don't know if that's useful information, but it might be.
I think it is. It's absolutely useful information. I mean, that's my opinion, at least. It's something that I think, for the most part, most of our students that we've seen in our neurodiversity community actually are diagnosed later. Like during like the particularly I think during the college experience, we do have several who were diagnosed like during the K through 12 experience or earlier. But like we'd have seen an increase of students who are, especially in our events like what Dr. Ashby referred to in our Curious events, who are either exploring identities during their college years, or or have actually been diagnosed during this time period and are seeking out community. And something that wasn't always the case, and with increased awareness and knowledge, we've been seeing more of that. And I think, if I had to guess, I think more students have been diagnosed, in like recent years than like in early childhood, so.
And another thing that is important, and Sam, I'm going to steal something you said in a training you and I did. So a lot of our undergraduate students did, unless they went to private schools, they did experience students with disabilities in a lot of their classrooms. And there has been much more talk about neurodivergence broadly in society. So some of us who are older reflect back on our, K-12 experience or our college experience and think that we attribute more stigma to it than the students who are currently undergrads may be attributing to it. And so we just want to be like thinking about, is this our stigma because of what it was like when we grew up? Or is this stigma that we're hearing from the students, right? And helping, that is not to say there is not still stigma, because there is. That is a huge barrier that still exists, right? But I think that may put it in perspective a little bit for some of us. And if we think about the fact that there are people getting diagnosed so much later, part of that is a shift in time that is a positive, right? And it's a really helpful thing to think about. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Thank you so much
Yeah,
for being here today. We're
absolutely.
really grateful to you all for being here. And, yeah,
Yeah,
feel
thank
free
you.
to reach out to us.
Yeah,